now.
So welcome to Lecture 9, everybody. So first of all, I have to mention this just because it's so germane to what we're talking about. And I thank a whole bunch of people sent me articles in the various different Israeli papers about this discovery about these brand new Dead Sea Scrolls here. So I just pulled up an article, just will touch on a couple points very quickly. So the Israeli archaeologists found these new scroll fragments, which were they believe were hidden during the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So Bar Kokhba revolt is 132 to 135 of the Common Era. The sect left the site about 68. So it seems like later on more people came back and hid different type of scrolls. And some of these scrolls are now finding where is the prophet? Where's the prophetic text? Where was it? It was right here. Okay, we talk about Zechariah, and some of these texts as well have been excavated, and then they found one from the Cave of Horror, which was named for the 40 human skeletons that were founded and excavated during the 60s. They bear also, interestingly enough, a Greek rendition of the 12 minor prophets. Minor prophets are Triasar. It's known as prophets are minor simply because they're minor, not because they were less important. Simply they didn't write as much as some of the other prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and those type of figures. So these are some of the new findings. This is a skeleton of a girl which was found. They found an ancient basket in there as well. So historians and scholars are really going to start going back through, looking at these new scrolls which are found, as well as the human remains and the artifacts. And should be fascinating to see what they come up with here. Okay, so here one of them was Zechariah, one of the scrolls which was scrolls which found the Greek translation of Zechariah. So pretty cool. Okay, let's get out of this and go back into my presentation, which I'm not sure where it was. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, just making sure.
I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, let me unplug my microphone and plug it back in and see if that helps. Is that better?
A little bit. Keep talking.
I'm talking.
It is.
It's better now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Okay, so I still hear some feedback. It help if you can mute yourself, and maybe I'm bouncing off someone else's too. So if you can mute yourself, unless you have a question, that would also be helpful. That may take care of the background noise. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, so here we're talking about the different types of Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have Dead Sea Scrolls basically which retell biblical stories, as we've discussed. We have an Aramaic translation into the book of Job. So we have in secondary languages, as we said. Aramaic was the lingua franca of Jews, particularly during the Second Temple period, after going into exile in Mesopotamia, where Aramaic was the spoken language. Many Jews during the Second Temple period are speaking Aramaic, even in Judea, and Hebrew is basically a scholarly language. They also found just a plain commentary on Genesis. But the most distinctive find is really the Pesher texts, which are, well, we'll explain what Pesher is in a moment. So what is Pesher? It's a style of biblical interpretation. And we'll give you an example. We have a biblical text which is quoted. And then after the text is quoted, that it will say it's Pesher. In other words, its meaning is. So we have a biblical text, and then there's going to be a commentary embedded in the text, which is going to tell you what the text actually means. And what it does is it reinterprets the passage out of its biblical context and applies it to present time. So every one of these commentaries is basically saying we're not particularly interested in the context in which the biblical prophecy happened. What we're interested in is applying the biblical text to today and to their day, to the day of the Qumran sect. So we have these Pesher texts. It's not in all the documents, but we have for Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and as well as the book of Tehillim. So today we're going to look at Pesher Habakkuk, which is, I believe, is the best known. Chapters 1 and 2, which was authored around the year of 610 before the Common Era. So just to put that in historical context, what is going on is the northern kingdom of Israel has been exiled. We just have a southern kingdom of Judah. And this is shortly before the destruction of a second temple. And what's actually going on specifically is there's a fight over Judah, which is an important land bridge between Egypt, the empire on one side, and on the other side we have Babylon and Assyria, which are really vying for control. And Judah is an important land bridge. And so Judah is really stuck in a lot of is really a pawn as these empires fight it out, and they're in a crucial piece of real estate. Okay, so let's now Habakkuk 1:5. So it's really emphasizing the importance of faith here. And as I said, mid 7th century, before the destruction of the first temple. So now we're going to actually look at Habakkuk 1:5. We have, behold the nations and see, marvel and be astonished, for I accomplish a deed in your days, but you will not believe it when told. Okay, very nice. So you think that would apply to what's the political situation I just spoke about, how Judea is a pawn between the Mesopotamian empires and the Egyptian empire. But the Pesher text, in other words, the Qumran people who are producing these aren't particularly interested in what happened earlier on. They're saying this concerns those who are unfaithful together with the liar, in that they did not listen to the words received by the teacher of the righteous from the mouth of God. Now, who could hazard a guess to who exactly the liar mentioned is here? You have to unmute yourself, remember.
Hasatan,
Well, I think that's Susan saying Hasatan,
yeah.
Satan.
Yeah.
Okay, the accuser, whatever that can mean various things, but the accuser comes to mean the devil, obviously, later on in popular culture. Okay, good guess, but we will see. They probably thought this
Rabbi?
guy was, yes, Scott,
I have one who could be the liar.
go ahead.
And this is based on Robert Eiserman,
Okay.
Paul the Apostle.
Okay, so if you go for a later dating of these texts, that could be a reference to Paul. So so let's look at that. So we have, first of all, we're going to get to this liar guy. So we have the teacher of the righteous as the leader of the sect. Of course, why should they mention his name or when exactly he lived to make things easy for us to figure it out? It is not mentioned. He seems to be somebody who wasn't with the sect originally, but shortly after they were founded, joined them and was able to really give them a lot of guidance here. So we have the teacher of the righteous is being set up against this liar figure. Perhaps it's the Apostle Paul, according to Professor Eiserman. But in the meantime, the teacher of the righteous, what's his big thing? He receives divine interpretation regarding the proper interpretation of the text. So he's basically going to tell people how to understand text. Now, this is really an issue. This is an issue because according to the Talmud, prophecy ended with the prophet Malachi. He's the last of the prophets. We just talked about the 12 prophets, that book of 12 prophets, Treyasar. He's the last one. He prophesizes a little after 500 BCE. And the Talmud says after Malachi, prophecy comes to an end. This is over 300 years later. So this, from a Talmudic point of view, remember the Talmud, the Mishnah itself, the first part of the Talmud isn't codified until 200 of the Common Era. We're now dealing with a period that is latest 68 of the Common Era, but undoubtedly even before that. So according to later Jewish views, this would be impossible to have this teacher of the righteous run around prophesying, because prophecy should have ended at least a good couple hundred years before he was alive. but of course, this is all looking back later on from Talmudic views the rabbis are constructing later on. So this was always assumed, by the way, that this Talmudic passage about prophecy ending with Malachi was a polemic against perhaps the Christians, and to Scott's point, Paul and figures like that are also prophesizing, re-understanding, reinterpreting the Jewish scriptures. The rabbis see this as a threat to their authority, and they're saying, no, these prophecies ended. You want to know what the Torah says? You can't walk around saying you're prophesizing. You have to understand the Torah through our point of view, and we're not going to do it through prophecy per se. We're going to do it by drasha, which means delving into the text and understanding through scholarship, through our erudition, exegesis, which has nothing to do with Jesus, by the way. It means that we're going to look into the text and figure out principles, but we're not going to let you undercut our authority by saying you're a prophet. So it was assumed this was a polemic against the Christians. Perhaps it could have been aimed at the Essenes as well. So but before we get to Habakkuk 1:6, it certainly, in light of this, it could be aimed at the Essenes, as that the Essenes seem to have an active prophecy going on with this teacher of the righteous. So now it looks like Habakkuk 1:6, the next verse. This refers to the Chaldeans as that bitter and nasty nation. Now, the Chaldeans are basically the Neo-Babylonians. There was an early Babylonian empire. Think about figures like Hammurabi, was such a time of Abraham, about 1800 before the Common Era. Then we have the latter Babylonian Empire, which basically is able to defeat the Assyrian Empire and reassert its authority. They destroy the first temple, of course, and they're referred to in Habakkuk 1:6 as that bitter and hasty nation, which is basically an overlord in Judah and will destroy the temple shortly after Habakkuk prophesizes. So the Qumran sect in their Pesher is not concerned at all about what happened during the first temple period. What are they concerned about? Understanding this phrase in light of their current situation. So they say it's a reference to the Kittim, which is a code word for Romans, who they say are quick and valiant in causing many to perish. So who is the bitter and nasty nation according to the sect? It's not the Chaldeans. They could care less about the Chaldeans. It's a reference to the Romans who are causing many to perish. So in other words, let's just say this flat out. For about 600 years later, the Habakkuk text was transmitted without anyone understanding its true meaning according to the Qumran sect, because people didn't understand this was a prophecy which was talking about the Romans. As far as everyone else was concerned, this was a prophecy talking about a situation as it was unfolding, or a prophecy about the very near future, not about a prophecy which would happen 600 years later. And now the Dead Sea sect and the teacher of the righteous are coming along and saying everyone was wrong. This was a prophecy to the much later into the future, or much more into the distant future, and we now are revealing this prophecy for everyone to understand. So everyone else who believed this was a clear, very straightforward prophecy about the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, were flat out wrong. Okay, so text only bears the meaning that the interpreter ascribes to it. So it gives the interpreter of the text a tremendous amount of power. Obviously, during history later on, we have these type of clashes. Again, think about the Protestant Reformation, where people are going back to the texts and saying we're going to reject these interpretations, which color the way we actually understand these texts, and we're going to go back to the texts themselves. So later on, we have these controversies play out again about the power we give to someone who interprets. But in the Qumran sect, the teacher of the righteous has tremendous power in really shaping the way people are going to read the text. By the way, just on an interesting kind of fun side note, the Protestants did believe in biblical interpretation. That's simply if you go back and look at, and they were big fans of going back and looking at Jewish texts. If you go back and look at Jewish texts, often the texts are ambiguous. It's unclear what exactly the texts are getting at. So do you know who the Protestant scholars like to consult as their interpretation? They weren't going to use the Catholic Church, obviously, because they had a bone to pick with them. So who did they use as their source for interpretation? Anyone want to
Jews.
guess?
The rabbi, the Jews.
Okay, the rabbi. They use the Talmud. They use the Talmud. You have scholars during this period going back and literally citing Talmud, taking sides in a machloket. I think it was Milton, if I'm correct, even though don't hold me to that, is making an argument against kingship. He's making an argument against kingship, and he cites the rabbinic side of the machloket, the debate in the Talmud, which says that there's not a command to have a king. So it's kind of ironic. Later, you have these Protestant scholars go back and they're looking at Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, to help them understand the Torah. Okay, so let's look at the next phrase from Habakkuk. You're supposed to, according to Habakkuk, write down the version and make it plain on the tablets. Okay, so that's unclear in its original meaning. Don't worry about it, because the teacher of the righteous will make it clear for you. And God told Habakkuk to write what happened to the final generation, but didn't make it known to him when the end would come. So who is this final generation that the teacher of the righteous is talking about? Remember, we said that they always think that the prophecy applies to them.
To the people at the time of the revolt.
Right. So the people living now, they're saying, the teacher of the righteous is saying, this is a reference to us. It's not a reference to, perhaps you might say, the final generation who's going to live in Jerusalem before they get exiled by the Babylonians in 586. No, we're not interested in them. This is a reference to us. And by the way, this is not particularly uncommon. You could all the time find religious leaders saying that this prophecy applies to us. Everyone always thinks they're living in the end of time, and the prophecy applies to us. So this is not particularly surprising. However, we should note, we've said before, that you did have a particular apocalyptic type of fever during this revolt against Rome, and again during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, perhaps even more, where people really thought the Mashiach was coming. It was the end of days. God's kingdom is coming to this world. So even though you have a lot today, even during this time, it was particularly heightened here. Yes, Harriet.
Maybe I missed this. Did we ever decide who the liar was?
Okay, so the liar. So I haven't. No, you didn't miss it. I haven't said it yet. I was kind of building to dramatic effect. So just hold on, Harriet, and we're going to get to it very soon. Okay. So, but thank you for pointing that out. So the Pesher understands in eschatological, excuse me, it's corrected to a different word, eschatological terms through that are not apparent in the text. So that's basically just what I said. So even though if you look at this this text of Habakkuk, write down the vision and make it plain on the tablets, which is a way of basically some sort of education during the time of Habakkuk. People had stelas all the time, and they would write down messages for people to see. That's not particularly surprising here. The Pesher is coming along and saying, no, this is talking about the end of days, even though it's not apparent. We're going to read into that. And the text continues that he who reads it may speedily. So what in the world does that even mean, right? It's almost like it seems like an incomplete sentence. But the Pesher will tell us what it means. The concerns the teacher of the righteous, to who God made all mysteries of the world to the servants of his prophets. So the teacher of the righteous is going to speedily basically tell everyone what these prophecies mean. Habakkuk 2:4 talks about the righteous shall live by faith, which you already discussed. So the assumption is that the righteous shall prosper, righteous people shall prosper because of the faith in God. Now, by the way, Judaism argues this because, and there's a lot of debate about this, because you don't need to be a particularly astute observer to see that often people have faith in God and are righteous and do what they're supposed to, don't do particularly well. Judaism discusses this all the time. This is not surprising that Judaism discusses it, but here Habakkuk is really trying to bring home the message, and this is not surprising because think about what's going on during Habakkuk time. The northern kingdom had been exiled. The southern kingdom is being ruled by foreigners. The temple is going to be destroyed soon. So Habakkuk is really emphasizing have faith in God and everything will be okay. Keep the faith, baby. Later on, 2 Maccabees, when they're revolting against the Seleucid or Syrian Greeks, same type of message here. Again, but the Pesher is going to look at it in their times when they're struggling with fighting with the other Jewish sects and they have the Romans to worry about. So they're saying this is a reference to all who observe the law in the house of Judah, who God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering and faith in the teacher of the righteous. So again, if you basically have faith in the teacher of the righteous, if you understand text through his teachings and basically are a disciple of the teacher of the righteous, you'll be delivered from the house of judgment. And it's saying, and it's basically saying all in Judah who hear this message and get the point and are willing to be disciples of the teacher of the righteous, you're putting yourself in good order and will be delivered from the house of judgment. Now, it's, as we've already said, it's kind of a bit of a contradiction because they do believe in predestination and predetermination on one hand. On the other hand, they seem to be saying that if you're willing to make the right choice and teach the teacher of the righteous, you'll be in good stead. And faith is directed again through the teacher of the righteous. Now, Paul comes along and understands this to be referring to Jesus and to the future life. So while we have the Pesher understands Habakkuk talking about the righteous as living by faith, the Pesher understands it to mean be a disciple of the teacher of the righteous. Paul comes along and says, nope, this means we have our own teacher and you're to follow Jesus, not the teacher of the righteous. To follow Jesus, that's your way of obtaining basically Olam Haba, the world to come. Okay, so this passage is central to the Qumran sect and to Christianity, as it's really giving the individual a way to channel his faith correctly and that he may attain afterlife. Again, not really surprising that Jews would be concerned about this. They're living under Roman occupation. There's a lot of tension and then as Paul dies and as the sect comes to an end in the 60s, it becomes more and more clear there's going to be a revolt against Rome. So there's a lot of concern about what happens to the fate of the individual as a country looks like it may fall. We see this by the way during Isaiah and Jeremiah, as the northern kingdom is threatened and then the southern kingdom is threatened, and it's unclear if the nation is going to survive. People are less concerned solely about the fate of the nation, and they want to know what's going to happen to me as an individual. If I'm good, even if the nation doesn't survive, is God going to be there for me? Think about what we say in Tafnan, Shomer Yisrael, Shomer Shelet Yisrael, that God should guard Israel and a remnant of Israel. In other words, at least the righteous people of Israel who are good. Even if the nation falls, the righteous will be protected. We have a midrashic idea that's appropriate. You could share at your Pesach Seder as well. The rabbis teach that during the 9th plague of Choshech, of darkness, 80% of Bnei Israel died because they were so ensconced in Egyptian morality, it was impossible for them to even come out of it and be saved. So we have this emphasis now on individual salvation, and you could see from a marketing point of view almost, particularly when your nation is not doing that well and there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty, people want that assurance that if they do what they're supposed to do, at the end of the day, God is going to be there for them. By the way, the rabbis promote that in Perikei Avot. It's actually in a Mishnah and Sanhedrin that's used as a header in Perikei Avot, saying that all of Israel has a share in Olam Haba. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem hilek Olam Haba. In other words, that if you remain part of the Jewish nation, you will be saved. You'll have a share in the world to come. Okay, Habakkuk 2:5. Woe to him who causes his neighbor to drink, who pours out his venom and to make them drunk, and that he may gaze at their feasts. Okay, so we're getting now to Harriet's question here. Who exactly is this liar here? So this is none other than the wicked high priest who pursues the teacher, that's the teacher of the righteous, to the house of exile, so he can confuse them with venom. Now, interestingly enough, this wicked high priest, and we'll talk about a little bit more about who he is. So he does something which is quite telling. He appears before them on Yom Kippur to confuse them and to cause them to stumble. So this wicked high priest, wicked high priest, is traveling on Yom Kippur to the Qumran sect on the date that the Qumran sect believes is Yom Kippur, to somehow get them to violate their Yom Kippur, probably by trying to convince them the day they're celebrating Yom Kippur is the wrong date. So this is another illustration of, yes, the different Jewish sects had different calendars, because this high priest, as far as he's concerned, he's a pious guy. Don't tell him he's wicked. This is according to the Qumran sect, he's wicked. So as far as he's concerned, he's pious, and he's not going to travel on the day he feels is Yom Kippur. That would be a violation of Yom Kippur to do so much traveling. You're not supposed to go, it's called a tchum, a boundary. You're not supposed to go beyond a certain point on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur. So, but nevertheless, according to the sect, he's going on the day which they feel is Yom Kippur and trying to confuse them and get them to sin. Okay, so now more explicitly, this they also call him HaKohen HaRasha, this wicked high priest, this evil priest. He's the arch nemesis of the teacher of the righteous, and maybe Jonathan the Hasmonean, who was the brother of Judah the Maccabee, who was a brilliant politician and was able to really consolidate power after Judah is killed in later combat against the Seleucid Greeks. But the Dead Sea sect sees him as an interloper. In other words, they're the true, at least the leadership of the sect are the true descendants of the high priest. They should be the high priest, and they see him as this country bumpkin priest whose family is from Modi'in, and basically has taken over the high priesthood. And on top of that, he and his Hasmonean descendants, who are ruling as high priests, aren't carrying out rituals correctly, and they're messing everything up. So therefore, the Dead Sea sect had to leave Jerusalem and set up a pure community, because this guy and his descendants have made such a mess of it in Jerusalem and are busy polluting the temple. Others say perhaps it was Yanai Alexander, who's a later king who's in league with the Sadducees. We've spoken about him before, and he killed a bunch of Pharisees as well. But that's one of the popular theories, is it's Yonatan or Jonathan. As Scott said, if you believe these documents were dated later on, perhaps you could understand it as Paul, as we see Paul is interpreting the same text in a different sense, a different way, which may have been offensive to the Qumran sect. And as I mentioned, obviously, there's a calendar issue as far as different calendars.
Rabbi?
Scott?
Rabbi? Yeah,
Yes.
with that said, and when I pointed out last week about the Habakkuk Pesher, we talked about the wicked priest and the house of exile. And remember, one of the things, and I don't know if you want to put it up again, but I think the class might find it really interesting, because it talks about his house of exile. And the problem with the Hebrew is, well, who's his? Is it the wicked priests, or is the teacher of righteousness? So when you look at that, and most people apply the house of exile to the teacher of righteousness, if you apply it to the wicked priest, and then you compare the Hebrew, avit galuto, that same phrase, bayit galta, is used in the Talmud, and it refers to the Sanhedrin, which was exiled from the Temple Mount during the Roman period, not during the Hasmonean. So that the wicked priest can't be Hasmonean priest, if anything, it probably was Ananias, who was the last priest appointed by Herod's descendants. And he pursues this teacher of righteousness. And because that would put this interpretation during the Roman period. So, and the Habakkuk Pesher refers to the liar, to the teacher of righteousness, and the wicked priest. These three characters do have analogies during the Roman period. And based on the Hebrew, like I said, if I could put that up, but I don't want to interrupt what you're doing, but I think the class would see.
Well, if you have it set up, or if you want, you could show at the end, whatever you want, Scott.
Okay, I'll do it when at the end. But I think the class may appreciate seeing the Hebrew and the connotations that it has.
Okay. So why don't you get that set up as I finish up the presentation?
Sure, go ahead, Rabbi.
Okay. So, and Ron, if you could make Scott a co-host so he could do the screen share as well. Thank you.
Rabbi, I already set it for participants to share screens.
Excellent, Alan. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at Pesher in the Christian Bible. Again, same method where we're going to take these texts and apply them to current situations. And it appears a few times we have these. So perhaps the most famous example comes from Isaiah 14. Hinei ha'alma hara v'yoledet ben v'karat shemo Emmanuel. So behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. So just to put this in context here, what's happening is Judah, as the southern kingdom, is being threatened by Assyria, and Ahaz, who is the king, wants to basically capitulate. He wants to capitulate to Assyria. He's under a lot of pressure. The northern kingdom of Israel is also pressuring him to capitulate to Assyria. And Isaiah, who's the prophet, is saying, no, you have to be strong, have faith in God, and I'm going to give you a sign. The sign is the young woman shall, in other words, your wife shall conceive. It could also be understood, I've heard it, to the young woman conceived like she had just given birth. You could read it either way, depends which scholar you want to follow. And but the young woman will conceive, or just conceived, and she had a son, or will have a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God will be with us. That's King Hezekiah, who's considered one of the great kings, according to the Talmud, who goes to war against idolatry. His father Ahaz had been a top-of-the-line idolater. But basically, the point is that the word Alma here means a maiden or a young woman. However, Alma takes on later on a secondary meaning, which is a virgin. So the Pesher then applies it and says this must be a reference to the future, several hundred years later, to, of course, Mary, Jesus, a virgin birth instead. So we see we're taking it out of context, applying it to a later context, and then it makes suddenly a very dramatic point. Another example are passages from Isaiah chapter 53, talks about the suffering servant, which in context seems to be speaking about how Isaiah himself is the servant who suffers. He's telling the people to do teshuvah, repent, and they're not interested in hearing it. They're mocking and humiliating him. This often happened to these prophets, so it could be a very difficult job. Or Israel can be the suffering servant who is suffering on behalf of the other nations. But of course, later on, as Christians, when they use the Pesher type of understanding, say, well, no, the suffering servant is not Isaiah or the nation of Israel suffering for everyone else's sins, and the world will be redeemed through the suffering of either Isaiah or through Israel. This is a reference to Jesus. Okay, so we have the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Christianity. So there's some dualism in common. We'll talk about the Essenes' dualism a little more. I'm not particularly sure what the reference was to The explicit reference was to in Christianity regarding dualism. I know during the different types of Christian thought, perhaps, have different takes on that. If anyone else, like if Susan or someone wants to fill in that would be great. But certainly we're going to talk more about the Essenes and the role of dualism, as they certainly do dabble in that much more than other Jewish groups are going to.
Rabbi, I would add something here.
Yes.
And thank you for the invitation to add something. But I would say that dualism, although it's not exclusively Jewish, that you can see evidence of it in whatever the guy's name is. I can't remember, who was the Jewish guy in Alexandria, Egypt.
Philo.
Yeah, Philo. You can see dualism in all of Platonic thought, which at that time was really absorbed by Christian thinking and by Jewish thinking as well. So there's a lot of that whole Plato and Aristotle, that dualism that existed in Greek thinking. So that's where essentially it comes from, I think.
Okay.
That's my experience.
Thank you. Yeah, and later, I mean, this is the mainstream rabbinical school of thought does not like dualism, but it doesn't mean, but it does live on through this Qumran sect and others. Okay, so moving on here. Okay, some Essenes and some early Christians were celibate, believing basically the world is coming to an end. So why bother to have more children, or just work on ourselves and get ready for God's kingdom? And another commonality is this revelation beyond the close of prophecy, according to the Jewish idea, where you have the teacher of the righteous is a prophet, and Christian scriptures is prophecy as well. Okay, so the next section, which will be next week, we're not having class because we're getting very close to Pesach. I figure people will be cleaning their kitchens and whatnot. So we'll meet again in 2 weeks, and let's give Scott an opportunity now to share what he wanted to show.
Thank you, Rabbi. Now let me see. Do I hit share screen? There we go. And what was my Habakkuk? Oh. Let me see if I can bring it up. I'm not sure why it's not coming up. Shoot. Oh wait, I have to open it. Let me see. That's the open. There we go. I'm not sure why it won't open on my end. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Does anyone have any general questions or comments while Scott tries to get that open?
Oh wait. Let's see.
Could I add something about the dualism idea?
Yes.
It may be that a lot of people don't understand the idea of dualism, but I wanted to give an example of how it plays out in Christianity a lot. And that is the idea that you can't have a spiritual world and a fleshly world that exist in the same space and the same time. The dualism gives basically a higher value to the spiritual world than it does to the physical world, or the real world, if you will. And I think that you see that a lot. You see it a lot in Paul and some of the New Testament. You see it a lot in certain aspects of, you can see it in the later writings of some of the Jewish prophets, like what you say in Habakkuk or wherever. You can start seeing that Greek influence in those places during that period of time of putting value on the spiritual and less value on the physical, which was not traditional Jewish at all. Traditional Jewish thought that both things could exist simultaneously with the same value. They didn't make those distinctions. The dualism comes as a result of what I was saying before, is the whole Greek idea that the spiritual world is better than the physical world, and that's pretty much Plato.
Right. So thank you, Susan. That's an excellent point. And Judaism, you really see over a long historical arc that in its initial phases, Judaism wasn't really interested in that at all. And or what you really had to look hard to find Jewish interest and kind of read text in a certain way and make a lot of assumptions. Where later on, because I think of contact with other religions, Judaism starts to evolve a theology that at least is more open to these type of ideas. Okay, so go ahead, Scott.
Scott, you're muted.
You're muted. You're muted, Scott. You're muted.
Okay, how about that? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Rabbi Sachs put up parts of the Habakkuk Pesher today. We discuss it, and here are several lines of what he discussed. That the actual text, Robert Eisen will provide the English translation. But one of the things I was talking about last week that I wanted to show you here is where we talk about the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness. It talks about the wicked priest pursuing the teacher of righteousness in his house of exile. And that's the red text, Avit Galuto. The aleph is kind of odd. If you cover it up, Beit Galuto means the house of his exile. And the vav here shows the possessive, his. But which one is it? Is it the Kohen, the wicked priest, or is it the teacher of righteousness? Most people have assumed it's the Moreh HaTzedek, the teacher of righteousness. But if you apply, and this is what Professor Eisman does, if you apply it to the Kohen HaRasha, to the wicked priest, with the realization that the Hebrew Beit Galuto is very similar to the Bayit Galta used in the Talmud in these locations that talk about the Sanhedrin being exiled from the Temple Mount. That's really important, because if that phrase is really very similar to this phrase, then that times the house of exile, that Sanhedrin was on the Temple Mount during the Hasmonean period. It was exiled during the Roman period. So that helps understand. He probably was pursuing the teacher of righteousness to the Sanhedrin, and the priest was the head of the Sanhedrin, or was on that panel. And what makes it even very more interesting is if you see the words being used in Hebrew, he pursues the righteous teacher to swallow him. That's a metaphor for destruction, to kill. Balo, which is very important. Bet, see the bet and the lamed, that's a B, and the lamed is an L. I want you to keep that in mind, bala, to swallow in Hebrew. If we were to assume what Professor Eisman does, that the Moreh HaTzedek, the righteous teacher, wasn't Jesus, it was a person by the name of James the Just. Notice the cognomen, just, Tzedek. That makes a perfect play. And we know that James was a very influential person during the end days of the temple who had conflicts with Paul. And we know from Josephus that the priest at the time was Ananias, and Ananias contrived with King Agrippa II to destroy James the Just. So, and we know from extrinsic evidence, the pseudo-Clementine recognitions, the pseudo-Clementine homilies about the existence of this James the Just, if that were who the teacher of righteousness was, then if you look at this, you'll start to know. Here's something that Professor Eisman learned that's very interesting. Bala, remember I said that, BL? That phonem in Greek, Bala, means to cast down. Cast down. And you know how many times the word cast down is in the New Testament? Casting nets, casting pearls before swine. This is really interesting. He makes an assumption. He says that all church presentations of the attacks on James, because Paul and James did have contentions we know from the book of Acts, but from the book of the Pseudo-Clementine homilies and the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, which are early church kind of apocrypha, those conflicts actually became physical altercations where somebody throws him down from the stairs of the temple, breaking his legs. So this idea of being cast down, it says that all of the church presentations of the attacks on the death of James are always expressed in terms of the Greek word root bala. So Bill Innes is in on this. He could ask his Professor Stephen. He should look into this. There's a connection that we have from Greek and Hebrew using a phoneme, bala, that would connect the character of who this Moread Tzedek could have been. And it seems to jive perfectly that the tripartite wicked priest, teacher of righteousness, and the spouter of lies, or the lying man. We know from the book of Romans and Galatians that Paul's always saying, I'm not a liar, I don't lie. He boasts. So this kind of evidence Eisenman has put together to come to the conclusion that this Habakkuk Pesher is probably writing about those incidents at the last period of time, because in the Habakkuk Pesher, they even use this phrase, Pistro al Kohanei Yerushalayim Hachronim. Its interpretation concerns the last priests of Jerusalem. So as Rabbi Sachs was saying, the end was near. This wouldn't be the Hasmoneans, because the temple was under any siege. This probably was being written at the time. The other thing to keep in mind is James the Just is killed in approximately 62 CE, according to Josephus. That's the period. That's just 4 years from the war, when the war began. And we know from the early church father Origen, he says he remembers seeing early writings from Hegesippus, who was a Christian historian, that the temple was destroyed not because of the death of Jesus, but because of the death of James. So all of these different coincidences have got to be, more than just coincidences. This probably was being written at the time just before the destruction, or just about when it was going to occur. And the reason I just wanted you to see the Hebrew again was because, remember what we said, it's always the term, the text. You want to see the phrasing in the Hebrew, and looking at similar documents at the period. And this idea of Avit Galuto and the Talmudic reference Bayit Galta or Beit Galta seem to be very pertinent to each other. And the fact that this idea of being Bala, to destroy, you can almost assume that when the Greeks and James's community, if the James's community is the so-called community that is the first Christians, it isn't who the New Testament says it is. It's probably what the Dead Sea Scrolls are telling us. They were never touched by the Romans, and they're written in Hebrew, not Greek. So could the first Christians really have been the Essenes, these zealots, these strong? We know from the Pseudo-Clementine homilies and the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions that James was a strict following Jew. He didn't believe in on the fence observances like the New Testament portrays the first Christians were. He was strict, just like the Essene documents that we've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And if that's the case, if James was the leader of this community that confronts Paul, what we have is basically we're back to the Maccabean, the Hellenists versus strict Torah observance again. But this time, the Jews don't win, the Hellenists win. And the Hellenists get to write the history, and they do. And the only thing we have from the so-called Essenes community that's left is this, that tells what was probably going on at the time. But these ideas, and again, I'm only professing what Professor Eisenman has theorized about this. but I think he makes a strong argument looking at the Hebrew, combining the contemporary texts, and this idea of looking how you can imagine, like I said, if the Hellenists and these strict Jews were arguing, confronting each other at the temple, they probably were speaking either in Aramaic or Hebrew, not Greek, because the Essenes wouldn't know Greek. And if you could imagine, could these people have been saying to the Greek Hellenists, you know, if you don't follow Torah, you're going to be Bala, you're going to be destroyed. And the Greeks, knowing the Hebrew and Greek, probably said, we'll give you a Bala. And they throw James down from the stairs and break his legs. And could this be kind of a ridiculing of the Hebrew, the writing of casting down? They're Bala. They're using these phrases to kind of ridicule the Hebrew that the Essenes, this group that was being led by James, was probably saying to the Hellenists, you know, you have to follow Torah. And this confrontation, the linguistics here is important. So I know I'm throwing a lot out there. I probably lost a lot of people.
Scott, I had a question.
Yes.
Do you think that the word Bala that you're referring to as Bala has any root in the word Baal?
Yes. That's an excellent point.
That appears, of course, all the time, because Baal was the false god that.
No, it's spelled differently. That's Beit Ayin Lamed.
No, it's the other way.
No, yes,
Listen.
Baal, Beit.
No, not
Ayin
Baal. She's not
Lamed.
talking about Baal. She's talking about Bilam.
No.
Oh.
Stop. There's two different.
Oh,
Irina's right about the Canaanite god.
yeah,
You're
Baal.
talking
I'm
about the
sorry.
word absorption in Hebrew. It's
Right.
a Hebrew word too. It's used in Hilchot Kashrut
Right.
as well, and we're going to later on see it in the course as well when we get into, again, dualism, God versus the evil.
Right.
evil one.
Right. But Irene, I apologize. Right, you were saying Baal. I was thinking Bilam.
No, I wasn't thinking of him, no.
Bilam definitely has connotations because that's spelled Bet Lamed Ayin. So Bilam has definitely connotations, and that character is cited in the Dead Sea Scrolls over, and it's also brought up in the Revelations and in many of the Christian documents. So there is a commonality. I'm sorry, Irene, I didn't.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah.
I wasn't listening. So there, I got on my tirade there. I just put it out there for people to consider and to consider.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. That's wonderful. And again, just hang on to that word, the Bet Lamed Ayin, as it will come up a little bit later on in the course as well. Okay, so you just want to exit out of the screen share if you can,
Yeah,
Scott?
let me find that button again.
It should be on the top, like a red button.
There it is. I see it.
Okay, so anyone else have any concluding questions, remarks? Okay, so thank you for joining.